Now, the big one, evolution. This is the great sacred cow of modern science, modern society. Actually, the church held material science or modern science at bay because the church maintained that God has created all the forms of life, and the scientists couldn't see a way around that. They wanted to. It's not that Darwin was the first evolutionist. He wasn't. Anaximander, Empedocles, these Greek philosophers, they'd already put forward the idea of evolution, that body parts were wandering around in the universe, and when they came together to form a viable organism, that was the origin of the pieces. They didn't have any scientific evidence. There were different others. Darwin's grandfather, for example, Erasmus Darwin, he also put forward a theory of evolution, basically on his own subjective conviction. He didn't have any scientific evidence as such. And after that, there were other authors also, before Darwin put forward his so-called theory. Darwin didn't actually have a theory. He said that the environment causes variations in the species. Actually, the environment doesn't cause variations in the species. If there are variations inherent in the genes, then they can come out, otherwise they won't. So that was the first part of his so-called theory. It was invalid. And then the second thing was, he said that these variations, under the influence of natural selection, which is constantly weeding out the less fit and encouraging the more fit, so these variations add up to give new species, new genera, and new orders of life, which is also a false idea. It's well known that variations don't accumulate to give new forms, new species. So he didn't actually have a theory. And actually, if you read through The Origin of Species, there's not a shred of actual direct scientific evidence for evolution. And he comes up with some really remarkable guesses. Like, for example, he mentions that somebody has seen a bear swimming around in the water with its mouth open catching flies. So he said, I see no reason, if this went on for a long period of time, why that shouldn't give rise to a huge animal like a whale. So he had a really remarkable imagination. And in fact, the theory of evolution, his so-called theory of evolution, is really a way of breaking down this apparently insurmountable leap of faith to a very small. You only have to believe in little changes, and then more little changes, and then you just have to believe that these little changes will mount up. That's all. So he was very, very intelligent in the way that he broke down the barrier of belief, of credibility, so that people could jump over the hurdle. And when they saw that they could do that, then it became an accepted fact. So now it is an accepted fact. This is the fact of evolution. If you don't believe in evolution, well, that's like thinking that the Earth's flat. It's a fact. Stephen Gould says that, interesting statement, he said that apples continue to fall, whether it's gravitation as Newton thought or whether it's gravitation as Einstein thought, but apples didn't stop falling. Similarly, he says, human beings evolved from apes, whether it was by the mechanism that Darwin thought or some other that we don't know yet. Amazing self-deception. So he's saying that evolution is a fact, but he doesn't know what the fact is. And this is actually the fact, that you're considered mad if you don't believe in evolution, but nobody knows actually what evolution is. And in fact, it's accepted by, scientists themselves have accepted that evolution is a faith. To come up to evolution, first of all, we have to look at where living beings or living bodies come from. In other words, where does life come from? So we've got the question of chemical evolution. This is another area of faith. At present, actually they don't know. And the more they find out, the less they know. The more they find out, the more difficult it seems to explain it all. This scientists themselves have accepted. There's a science writer for New York Times. He said, everything about the origin of life on Earth is a mystery. And it seems the more that's known, the more acute the puzzle gets. Now, this is not a healthy sign. It's a sign that they're going in the wrong direction, but of course they won't take the omens. I just briefly go... I don't want to go into technicalities at the moment. I can just briefly go through some of the features. Everybody knows that Stanley Miller, proved that living matter, maybe even cells, could come just by lightning zapping the primitive soup on Earth. This is a myth. Miller carried out an experiment where he had electric discharge going through an atmosphere of nitrogen, ammonia, nitrogen, methane maybe, I don't remember the exact composition. And with a cold trap, he was able to get several of the amino acids that are necessary to build up biomolecules. He didn't get biomolecules. And the atmosphere that he was using was not the atmosphere which appears to have been present on the early Earth, if we accept geological evidence. They say it's carbon dioxide. So the conditions for his experiment were quite wrong. So then, what about the primeval soup? Their idea is that you've got a primeval soup of all these amino acids, and that they gradually form by constant combination, breaking up, and eventually you get the necessary biomolecules. Well, actually, the primeval soup, because biomolecules, they're high-energy compounds, so they would naturally break down into the smaller elements. They wouldn't build up into larger elements. So the primitive soup would just remain a stinking soup of ammonia and other... It wouldn't make biomolecules at all. Then they get amino acids, but to get proteins from amino acids, then they have to shift scenarios, because then you have to have not only a dry environment, but a dehydrating environment. So you start off with a primeval soup, and then you have to go from that to... Maybe on the edge of volcanoes, it could have, these proteins could have appeared on the edge of volcanoes. They're just fantastic scenarios. There's nothing, again, it's nothing to do with direct experience. A big problem that they have is when you analyze the actual composition of biomolecules, they're fantastically specific. They're huge, they're gigantic molecules, and they're very, very specific. The sequence, for example, of amino acids in the proteins is very, very specific. And when you start calculating what is the probability that one of these molecules, and what to speak of a collection of these molecules could come together by chance, we're coming to inconceivable odds against. Like, for example, one estimate, to make a small bacterium, the odds against the biomolecules for that coming together is 1 with 40,000 zeros against. Now, 1 with 40,000 zeros, that's a lot. It's like 100 yards of zeros. So the point is that it's obvious, that it's self-evident that living beings don't come together by chance. Everybody's known that all through the years. And it's only when the material scientists said, no, we can explain how this happened, that people started to believe, well, okay, maybe we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's true. Or they've proved it. But actually, there's no theory, and there's no possibility of a theory. I mentioned before, when you get to numbers over 1 with 150 zeros, you're beyond the range of conceivability. You're beyond the range of possible direct experience. So in other words, if you've got a theory that involves believing in something, an event, with a probability, again, like odds against, of more than 150 zeros, you're outside the range of any possible coherent theory. It's just belief in miracles, that's all. So on the one hand, it's self-evident that living beings don't come together just by physical interactions. And on the other hand, the physical scientists cannot come up with a consistent theory explaining how that could have happened. So we should go back to the self-evident. Like you accept the direct evidence. When we come to talk about DNA, RNA, these contain the information in the genetic code, which is supposed to determine biological form, and this enables living beings to replicate themselves. So one problem here is that the DNA produces the proteins. These are the enzymes which enable processes in the cell to take place. And the enzymes produce the DNA and RNA, which produce the enzymes, which produce the DNA and RNA, which produces the enzymes. So how did that cycle come together? Even as Jacques Monod, for example, he said it's very, very difficult to understand how this could have happened. In other words, there's an inconceivable potency which has put this extraordinary cycle into nature. DNA in the human being contains about as much information as 900 volumes of 500 pages each. I mean, that's a staggering amount of information. So the question is, where did that information come from? Information, I've already explained, that information is not physical. So physical laws, there's no way of explaining how physical interactions can produce that amount of information. It's not possible. And information theory, I mean, if you want to calculate it, it gives, again, a staggering improbability. Not even an improbability, staggering odds against, which means it's beyond the limit of conceivability. And scientists themselves, information scientists of others, have said, look, it looks like a signal from an intelligent source. They've admitted the origin of the genetic code is perhaps the most perplexing problem in evolutionary biology. And in American Scientist, a writer said, an intelligible communication via radio signal from some distant galaxy would be widely hailed as evidence of an intelligent source. So then what about the DNA, the information in DNA? He says, after all, DNA information is not just similar to a message sequence such as Morse code, it is such a message sequence. So the only rational explanation is that some intelligence has produced the information in the genetic code. Anyway, an inconceivable potency. So the conclusion, Francis Crick, a notable atheist, he actually co-discovered DNA. He says, an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. In other words, they're outright admitting, yes, there's inconceivable potency there, which is the prediction from the theory. The theory of empirical frustration says that. They're going to show that there's inconceivable potency. And Isley, who's a prominent evolutionist, he wrote about evolutionists. He says, after chiding the theologian for his reliance on myth and miracle, science found itself in the unenviable position of having to create a mythology of its own. Namely, the assumption that what, after long effort, could not be proved to take place today, had in fact taken place in the primeval past. In other words, he's saying they're working on myth. It's a myth. Next stage, how do you get from molecules to cells? Now, cells are very complex. They're more complex, far, far more complex than the most complex machine. So if machines can't come together just through physical interactions, if it takes technology, it takes design to create a machine, then what to speak of the cell? And scientists themselves have admitted this. There's one, Harold Klein, Santa Clara University. He said, the simplest bacteria is so damn complicated from the point of view of a chemist that it's almost impossible to imagine how the natural chemical origins of life happened. In other words, again, inconceivable potency. He's admitting it. And Lipson, a fellow of the Royal Society, he said, looking at this field, the only acceptable explanation is creation. He said, I know that this is anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me, but we must not reject a theory that we don't like if the experimental evidence supports it. So this conflict is there. There's many scientists actually, they admit that the evidence points to design, but that can't be accepted into the body of science itself.